Hello, this is a homily for the second Sunday of Advent, and if you remember last week we started with the readings describing the basic situation, so that would be first Sunday of Advent, the basic situation in which we find ourselves in this constant and irreplaceable relationship with God. Here on the second Sunday, we have the readings from Genesis and the Gospel, and here we find God acting in our human history. These are not simply ideas. We've had millions of people killed because of ideas over the last 100 years. Here you have a real God intervening in a real way in history in ways that the witnesses can attest to. Starting with the book of Genesis, chapter 15, we have the beginning, really, of the great people of God of the Old Testament, where you have the Lord looking at Abraham, giving him a promise that he will have descendants like the stars in the sky. And God then makes a covenant with Abraham. And the covenant is done in the old style. This is a series of sacrifices of different animals. And interestingly enough, Abraham cuts the animals in half. It's God who passes through the various pieces of flesh that are lying there. And he is the dominant partner in this covenant, and Abraham simply watches. It's an extraordinary event that happens in Abraham's life, but it means that God has forever bound himself to Abraham, and vice versa. And then he promises him land, and once he's promised him land, the covenant is now set. An interesting line here is that Abraham puts his faith in the Lord, who credited it to him as an act of righteousness. In other words, he's going to trust God, and he's going to trust God absolutely, regardless of what's going on in his family or among his people, or with foreigners who are attacking his people. Whatever it happens to be, he is going to trust God and trust that God is with him. The being with part is part of the covenant. So there you have this glorious commitment that God makes to humanity through Abraham. In the second reading then, in the psalm then, we have the psalm of the faithful one. The Lord is my light and my salvation. The Lord is my life's refuge. Well, you could hear these words being used by Abraham, although this psalm is much later than the time of Abraham. You have also this final line in the last verse, I believe that I shall see the bounty of the Lord in the land of the living. Already in this life, in this history of events, the writer of this psalm is confident that he will see the bounty, the goodness, the blessings of the Lord expressed in his life. So a psalm of absolute faith and confidence. In the second reading, which is from Philippians chapter 3, Paul is writing to the community in Philippi, and he says, join with others in being imitators of me, brothers and sisters. Now, this may sound incredibly arrogant, but in fact, as we know from the history of Paul, God has already made a covenant with Paul, just like he made a covenant with Abraham. Different style, but same idea. God has committed himself to work through Paul, and Paul has committed himself to work for God. Consequently, you have Paul being filled with the Spirit of God and literally living the life of God here on earth. And consequently, if he's telling people to be imitators of him, It's not really him, it's him reconfigured to be like Christ in this world. And that brings us immediately to the gospel, where we look at a little piece of the gospel of Luke chapter 9. And here you have Jesus, first of all, very first word, and what you have is in this man, Jesus Christ, you have this covenant between God and man that literally is being lived out in the history of the Jewish people in the first century. Now, Jesus takes Peter, John, and James with him, so he has witnesses. These are not people who are going to smoke pot. They are not going to be on drugs. They are not going to set up a business to make money out of religion. They are going to follow their master, Jesus Christ. You know the story of the Transfiguration. Jesus is transformed, literally radiating the divine glory that he is through his being into the world. Appearing with him are Moses and Elijah, two giant figures of the Old Testament. One is a leader, one is a prophet, and essentially what you have is a reminder to James and John and Peter that this man whom they are following is in fact first of all divine, and secondly that he is way up there with Moses and Elijah, and in fact given that he is the one who is radiating this light, superior to them. Peter then says to Jesus, let us make 3 tents, a sign of adoration in this case, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. So Peter is recognizing that Jesus is up there, even though he is the man who walks around with them and has breakfast with them and talks in the public squares and so forth. He is in fact a giant in the history of Israel. Then a last event from this, after this event about the tents, you have a voice coming from the cloud and saying, this is my chosen son, listen to him. The beloved son is a figure who's mentioned many times in the Old Testament, and basically it is a figure of one who is going to do God's bidding. And so here you have Jesus being announced as the one who is doing the will of God in human history by his walking around, by his teaching, by his healing, by all the beautiful events that come out of his life. He is, in fact, fulfilling the will of God and showing it to people. And this is, again, a big part of spirituality and Catholic spirituality, that we conform our lives and also allow ourselves to be conformed by the grace of God. We conform our lives to Christ, and then other people see him in us. So what we're seeing through the readings is that God has chosen to work in the middle of history, in human history. He is going to walk around and be with us and reach us where we are. All of this being done to express the will of God for the whole world, but also to show God's love for his people, and very importantly, our love for God, because in the union of life, Abraham has to do certain things to show that he is at the service of God. Paul has to do certain things to show that he is at the service of God. Jesus has to do certain things to show that he is at the service of God. And so you have this way in which the message of salvation now becomes concrete. It's not just a program for a religion. It's not just ideas that people generated around the water cooler. This is the presence of God in history to transform the whole of history. Have a good day.